The forge stood silent in the pre-dawn gloom, its stones still radiating warmth from yesterday's labor. Soon, young Thomas would stoke the embers once more, and the familiar symphony of hammer on anvil would echo through the village. But for now, in these quiet moments before the world stirred, we can examine more closely the intricate web of relationships that bound the medieval blacksmith to his community, and the slow transformation of both craft and craftsman across the centuries. The bond between blacksmith and village was far more nuanced than mere commerce. Edmund's forge served as an unofficial gathering place, a nexus where news traveled and alliances formed. When harvests failed, farmers arrived not just seeking tool repairs, but pleading for credit, for patience, for time to pay. Edmund, his own survival tied to theirs, would extend what grace he could, knowing a destitute customer served no one. Yet this interdependence bred its own tensions. The blacksmith's vital role granted him security, but also made him a target for resentment. When iron grew scarce, villagers whispered that Edmund hoarded the precious metal, that his prices were unjust. During outbreaks of plague, some eyed the forge's infernal glow with suspicion, wondering if the smith's mastery over fire had attracted darker forces. The medieval mind saw connections everywhere, and the blacksmith's command of flame placed him at the crossroads of sacred and profane. Fire was both creator and destroyer, the force that reshaped raw ore into plowshares, yet also the element that devoured homes and lives. This duality shadowed every smith's reputation. While respected for their skill, they were also regarded with uneasy awe. Thomas learned early that managing perceptions was as crucial as managing the forge. A blacksmith who prospered too visibly risked accusations of greed or witchcraft. One who appeared too poor might be deemed incompetent. The successful smith walked a razor's edge, displaying enough expertise to command respect while maintaining the humble demeanor expected of a craftsman. The guild system emerging in larger towns during the late medieval period brought both opportunity and constraint. These brotherhoods of craftsmen promised protection, standardized training, and regulated competition. For a village smith like Edmund, guild membership could mean access to better materials, established trade routes, and a voice in civic affairs. But it came shackled with obligations. Strict rules governed everything from iron quality to pricing. Apprenticeships stretched 7 years or longer, and masters jealously guarded their secrets, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to practice legally. Had Thomas lived in a guild town, his path to mastery would have been more structured, yet more confined. Guild apprentices lived under their master's roof, bound by contracts dictating not just their labor, but their conduct. They couldn't marry without permission, couldn't leave service prematurely, and were barred from learning the craft's deepest mysteries until deemed worthy. The guilds also forged new hierarchies within the trade itself. Master smiths who paid hefty fees and proved their skill earned the right to train apprentices and sell goods freely. Journeymen, skilled but unestablished, wandered between workshops, earning wages while honing their craft. At the bottom remained the apprentices, toiling for scraps and the faint promise of future advancement. These distinctions bred tensions unknown in simpler times. Where Edmund and Thomas once shared hardships as equals, a guild might have rendered their relationship transactional, obligations spelled out in ink rather than sealed through shared sweat. The evolution of metallurgy itself reshaped the smith's world. Improved furnace designs allowed hotter, more controlled fires. New refining techniques yielded more consistent iron. Water-powered trip hammers in some regions mechanized tasks once demanding pure muscle. Yet these innovations cut both ways. Better iron meant sturdier tools, pleasing customers, but also longer-lasting wears, reducing the need for replacements. Mechanical hammers could shape large pieces efficiently, but required costly investments only viable near rivers. For smiths in remote villages like Millbrook, such advances remained distant rumors. Edmund's forge operated much as his grandfather's had, relying on calloused hands, a keen eye, and wisdom passed down through generations. The rift between urban and rural smithing widened, creating distinct classes of craftsmen with unequal access to progress. Specialization accelerated too. While Edmund remained a generalist by necessity, cities birthed artisans focusing solely on armor, blades, or locks. This fragmentation brought both refinement and risk. Those who mastered niche trades might secure wealthy patrons, while jacks of all trades faced creeping obsolescence. Economic pressures on medieval smiths were relentless and multifaceted. Iron prices swung wildly based on distant wars or failed harvests. A lord's whims could shutter trade routes overnight. Edmund's ledger, had he kept one, would have revealed his enterprise's precariousness. A single large commission, shoeing horses for a merchant caravan or forging weapons for a noble's retinue, might sustain him for months. But such windfalls were rare. Survival usually hinged on a torrent of petty tasks: mending hinges, sharpening blades, crafting humble household goods. Credit and debt wove another layer of complexity. Customers often lacked coin, especially in lean years, forcing elaborate barter systems. Edmund might shoe a farmer's horse in exchange for grain, or repair a merchant's wagon wheel against promises of future iron deliveries. These arrangements demanded shrewd judgment. A smith too generous with credit might starve on empty promises. One too rigid could drive clients to rivals, or leave them without essential services. The adept blacksmith needed more than technical skill. He had to read character, weigh risks, and navigate webs of obligation thicker than forged smoke. Seasonality added another wrinkle. Spring brought farmers begging plowshares and hoes. Summer demanded scythes for harvest. Autumn required tools for processing crops. But winter was a gauntlet, when travel froze and fields lay fallow. Prudent smiths stockpiled goods in flush seasons, but this required capital many lacked. The feast or famine cycle meant even prosperous smiths lived with gnawing uncertainty, never knowing when the next drought might threaten their survival. The physical toll mounted as smiths aged. Decades of heat, smoke, and strain ravaged bodies already starved of nutrition or medicine. Respiratory ills plagued those who inhaled coal dust and metal fumes daily. Joints stiffened from swinging hammers. Backs hunched permanently over anvils. Edmund's hands, once deft and unmarked, now bore his trade's brutal signature. Burns from stray sparks stippled his forearms like pale constellations. Years of gripping hammer handles had calloused his palms and twisted his fingers. His spine, bent eternally toward the forge, had settled into the stoop that marked him as clearly as any guild badge. Yet amid the hardship flickered embers of fulfillment. Transforming raw iron into vital objects retained its near-mystical allure. The gratitude of villagers relying on his repairs affirmed Edmund's purpose. The gradual accumulation of skill, knowledge no thief could steal, offered a wealth beyond coins. Thomas, now in his second apprenticeship year, began sensing these compensations alongside the blisters. His hands, though scarred, grew stronger and surer. His eye learned to gauge iron's heat by its glow, to read the subtle cues signaling when metal was ripe for shaping. Most crucially, he tasted the deep satisfaction of creating something indispensable with his own battered hands. The dynamic between master and apprentice shifted as Thomas's skills grew. Edmund's initial sternness gave way to grudging respect for the boy's grit and growing competence. The relentless corrections of early months yielded to nuanced guidance, even rare praise. This evolution revealed a fundamental truth. Blacksmithing couldn't be learned from scrolls or sermons, only through patient practice under a watchful eye. The subtle arts separating masterwork from mediocrity passed through demonstration and repetition, etching themselves into muscle memory and instinct. The blacksmith's social standing varied wildly across regions and eras. In guild strongholds, some smiths climbed to wealth and political clout. Master smiths in bustling cities might own properties, employ teams, and rub elbows with merchants and mayors. But in hamlets like Millbrook, the smith's status stayed ambiguous, essential yet peripheral. Prosperous by local standards, Edmund remained powerless in the greater feudal hierarchy. This limbo shaped every aspect of his existence, from marriage prospects to legal rights. A thriving smith might wed his daughter to a shopkeeper, using his trade's profits to buy social mobility. But such leaps were fragile, easily undone by a single lean season. Religious dimensions further complicated the smith's world. Church teachings framed labor as virtuous, and shaping metal as participation in divine creation. Yet the smith's kinship with fire also linked him to older pagan lore that unsettled clerics. Folklore brimmed with tales of smiths breaking curses or forging enchanted blades, stories officially discouraged but stubbornly persistent. Saints' days and holy decrees brought both respite and strain. Church bans on Sunday labor meant lost income, yet these pauses also gathered communities in ways that bred new business. A pious smith might win commissions from abbots or devout patrons. Warfare ensured smiths' indispensability even as society evolved. The medieval world's constant conflicts demanded endless weapons and armor. While village smiths like Edmund rarely crafted elaborate arms, they constantly repaired and adapted the tools of war. Even in peacetime, the threat of violence meant communities needed smiths who could repurpose farm tools into weapons, plowshares into spearheads, pruning hooks into blades. This dual-use reality gave blacksmiths strategic importance in local defense. Yet the knowledge for true weapon-making was guarded fiercely. Any competent smith could forge a basic blade, but crafting battle-worthy steel required closely held secrets, achieving the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility, creating edges that held under duress. These skills separated village craftsmen from master weaponsmiths. As medieval society bled into the early modern era, the blacksmith's world shifted fundamentally. The rise of blast furnaces and advanced metallurgy began centralizing iron production, challenging the village smith's role. Firearms reshaped warfare, making traditional armor less relevant while creating demand for gun barrels and shot. But these changes unfurled slowly, and for most of the medieval period, the blacksmith remained the community's beating heart. Edmund's forge, with its glowing coals and ringing anvil, symbolized more than commerce. It embodied human ingenuity's triumph over raw nature. The smoke coiling from his chimney signaled normalcy to villagers, proof that the essential work of crafting and maintaining metal endured. The rhythmic hammering provided a reassuring soundtrack to daily life, a reminder that skilled hands stood ready to solve any problem. In the end, the medieval blacksmith's tale is one of human resilience. Confronted with technological limits, economic instability, and social constraints that would crush modern souls, craftsmen like Edmund and apprentices like Thomas found ways not just to endure, but to contribute meaningfully. Their legacy transcends the objects they forged. In their workshops, crucial technologies were preserved and refined. Through their apprentices, vital skills survived generations. In their daily dealings, they strengthened the social fabric holding communities together. The medieval smith's world was harsh, demanding, often brutal. But it was also a realm where skill mattered, where honest work held value, and where transforming Earth's raw materials into useful things remained sacred. As the forge fire dimmed at day's end, and Thomas swept iron filings from the anvil, both master and apprentice could take pride in work well done, in metal properly shaped, in tools that would serve faithfully in the days ahead. The great wheel of seasons would keep turning, bringing fresh trials and chances to the forge. Yet the core rhythms of the blacksmith's life would hold constant. The daily lighting of the fire, the careful selection of iron, the patient shaping of stubborn metal into forms both beautiful and necessary, and the quiet dignity of mastering one of humanity's oldest and most vital crafts. The persistent ringing of hammer on anvil shattered the morning silence as dawn bled across the medieval village. For the blacksmith, this wasn't merely the start of another workday, but the continuation of an unending cycle of fire, metal, and sweat that would consume every waking hour. The forge already glowed with embers carefully nurtured through the night, demanding immediate attention. Fresh coal needed layering. The massive bellows required pumping, and the fire bed coaxing to reach the precise temperature needed for the day's labor. The medieval blacksmith's workshop was a chaotic ballet of organized madness. Tools dangled from every available surface, their forms perfected through centuries of trial and error. Hammers of varying weights and sizes lined the walls, delicate cross-peen hammers for intricate work, monstrous sledges for heavy forging, specialized ball-peen hammers for riveting and shaping. Tongs in dozens of configurations gripped, searing metal in ways human hands never could, their jaws shaped to clutch everything from slender wire to massive iron bars. The anvil stood as the undisputed heart of operations, a monstrous iron block weighing several hundred pounds. Its surface, polished smooth by countless hammer blows, or the scars of generations. The horn protruding from one end allowed for crafting curves and circles, while the hardy hole served as a socket for specialized tools. Every inch of the anvil had purpose, and a skilled smith could produce dozens of shapes using just this single implement. Yet the true mastery lay not in the tools, but in the blacksmith's ability to read the metal itself. Iron and steel behaved differently at varying temperatures, revealing their secrets only to trained eyes. The smith learned to recognize subtle color shifts indicating when metal was ready for specific work: dull red heat for bending, bright orange for drawing out, yellow heat for welding, and the treacherous white heat that could ruin metal if mishandled. This knowledge wasn't gleaned from books or lectures, but through years of apprenticeship beginning in childhood. A blacksmith's son might start by manning the bellows, a deceptively demanding job requiring constant attention and surprising strength. The rhythm proved crucial, providing just enough air to sustain the fire without creating destructive flare-ups. As the boy grew stronger and more observant, he'd graduate to holding pieces for the master smith, learning to anticipate needed tools and adjustments before they were called for. The progression from apprentice to journeyman to master wasn't measured in years, but in accumulated wisdom and the development of near supernatural intuition about hot metal's behavior. A master blacksmith could judge iron's temperature by its glow in complete darkness, could feel through his hammer the exact instant when a piece needed turning, could hear in the anvil's ring whether metal was perfectly heated or cooling past usefulness. The variety of work demanded of a medieval blacksmith was staggering. In a single day, he might shoe a horse, repair a plow, forge nails, mend a cooking pot, sharpen tools, and craft decorative pieces for the local church or manor house. Each task required unique techniques and understanding of how metal behaved under specific conditions. The blacksmith was simultaneously craftsman, engineer, and artist, producing both purely functional items and works of decorative beauty. Horseshoeing alone was a complex art requiring knowledge beyond metalwork, understanding equine anatomy and animal behavior. Each horse's hoof was unique, demanding custom-forged shoes. The smith worked swiftly, knowing keeping a horse balanced on 3 legs was uncomfortable for the animal and dangerous for himself. Shoes had to be shaped precisely, heated to the perfect temperature for fitting, and nailed securely without damaging the hoof. Agricultural tools represented another major category. Plowshares wore down quickly in rocky medieval soil, needing constant sharpening and replacement. Scythes and sickles required exact curves and tempering to slice cleanly through grain. Axes and other blades needed careful attention to the balance between hardness for edge retention and toughness to prevent shattering. Even the humble nail demonstrated the smith's remarkable skill. Each was individually forged from iron rods, heated, drawn out, and headed through a series of precise operations. A master smith could produce hundreds daily, each nearly identical despite being entirely handcrafted. This consistency proved crucial for construction and shipbuilding, where uniformity ensured structural integrity. Weapons and armor represented the pinnacle of the blacksmith's art, requiring not just technical skill, but near-scientific metallurgical knowledge. A proper sword blade needed to be hard enough to hold an edge, yet flexible enough not to snap on impact, achieved through controlled carbon content and sophisticated heat treatments that varied along the blade's length. The spine might be left relatively soft for flexibility, while the edge was hardened for durability. Creating a sword began with selecting the right iron and steel. Medieval smiths learned to recognize metal grades by their spark patterns when ground, their behavior in the forge, and their response to treatments. The finest swords used pattern-welded steel, twisted strips of iron and steel forged together, creating both strength and distinctive watery patterns prized by warriors. Chainmail, that iconic medieval armor, represented thousands of hours of meticulous labor. Each ring was individually forged, shaped, and linked to its neighbors with absolute consistency. A single weak link could mean death for the wearer, so mail specialists maintained perfect quality across countless components. The blacksmith's social position was complex and often contradictory. While his skills were indispensable to medieval society, without smiths, agriculture would fail, warfare couldn't be waged, and daily life would collapse. He remained marked by the soot and sweat of manual labor. This liminal status created both opportunities and frustrations. A competent smith was always in demand, commanding good wages. Yet he was still viewed as separate from the noble warrior or scholarly cleric. This ambiguous status manifested in folklore and literature, where smiths appeared as both helpful craftsmen and mysterious figures wielding supernatural powers. The god Vulcan, the legendary Wayland the Smith, and countless other mythological figures linked smithing to divine or magical abilities. Real blacksmiths sometimes encouraged these beliefs, as the awe they inspired could prove useful in negotiations. The guild system provided structure and protection. Blacksmith guilds controlled who could practice the trade, set quality and pricing standards, and offered support for members and families. Guild membership signified respectability and competence, but came with obligations. A guild smith had to maintain standards, contribute to guild activities, and often couldn't work outside his designated area without permission. Training within guilds was rigorous and hierarchical. An apprentice blacksmith would serve 7+ years learning the trade's basics, receiving little to no pay while being completely dependent on his master for food, shelter, and instruction. The master held absolute authority, able to physically discipline apprentices, control their movements, and dictate their social interactions. This total control was justified as necessary for both skill and character development. Upon completing his apprenticeship, a blacksmith became a journeyman, free to work for wages, but not yet qualified to establish his own shop. To achieve master status, a journeyman had to create a masterpiece, demonstrating competence in all trade aspects. This piece was judged by guild masters, with only the worthy gaining full membership rights. The daily grind was dictated by fire and daylight. Work began before dawn with lighting the forge, a delicate process ensuring clean, even burns throughout the day. Early tasks often involved completing yesterday's unfinished work, items needing final touches or polishing. As morning progressed, heavier forging operations commenced when energy levels were highest. Afternoons might focus on precision work requiring good light and steady hands. The workshop brimmed with dangers: fire, hot metal, heavy tools. Burns were occupational hazards every smith learned to endure. Constant exposure to heat and sparks left most with scarred hands and arms, while serious injuries loomed as ever-present threats. Flying sparks could blind, and years of inhaling smoke and metal particles ravaged lungs. The physical demands were enormous. Swinging heavy hammers for hours built tremendous upper body strength, but led to joint damage and chronic pain. Summer heat was especially brutal. Temperatures near the forge could exceed human endurance limits. Dehydration was constant, and many smiths developed permanent spinal curvature from bending over anvils. Hearing loss from relentless hammering was practically guaranteed. Yet amidst the hardship flickered genuine satisfaction. Unlike many medieval jobs where labor's fruits might take seasons to appear, the smith saw daily tangible results, finished products emerging from raw materials. There was pride in solving technical challenges, in watching one's creations serve practical purposes, in the gradual accumulation of hard-won expertise. The relationship between smith and customer was often deeply personal. In small communities, the smith knew everyone and understood their specific needs. He might craft special tools for local craftsmen, repair cherished family heirlooms, or create decorative ironwork for the parish church. These connections gave the work meaning beyond mere commerce. The smithy frequently served as a social hub, especially during long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. The forge's warmth drew neighbors to gossip, share news, and discuss village affairs. As a central economic figure, the smith often learned about local politics, trade developments, and social changes before others. As medieval society evolved, so did the blacksmith's role. Growing towns created opportunities for specialization. Some smiths focused exclusively on locks, weapons, or decorative ironwork. This specialization allowed for higher quality products, but also increased competition and the need for innovation. Water-powered machinery began changing the craft's nature. Water wheels could drive massive bellows, maintaining consistent forge temperatures, while trip hammers delivered blows no human could match. These innovations boosted productivity, but required significant capital and access to flowing water, advantages favoring urban workshops over rural traditionalists. Trade networks expanded the smith's world beyond local boundaries. Imported iron, specialized tools from distant regions, and techniques learned from traveling craftsmen all contributed to the trade's evolution. This knowledge exchange connected individual smiths to a pan-European network of artisans and merchants. Religious aspects also influenced the work. Churches required metalwork for doors, hinges, locks, and decorative elements. Creating religious artifacts, from simple crosses to elaborate reliquaries, represented both technical challenge and spiritual devotion, with these pieces often surviving centuries as testaments to their maker's skill. The blacksmith's economic importance cannot be overstated. In a world where nearly everything was handmade, the smith's role in creating and maintaining tools was fundamental to all other economic activity. Farmers, carpenters, soldiers, all depended on the blacksmith's output. A society's productivity was largely determined by its smith's capacity and skill. As we reflect on the medieval blacksmith's life, we see a figure embodying both his era's harsh realities and remarkable achievements. His days overflowed with back-breaking labor, constant danger, and the forge's relentless heat and smoke. Yet, through skill and determination, he created the tools and weapons that shaped medieval civilization, bridging Earth's raw materials and humanity's needs in an age when craftsmanship was paramount. The medieval blacksmith's legacy extends far beyond the Middle Ages. Their techniques, tools, and traditions formed foundations for the Industrial Revolution. Their understanding of metallurgy, heat treatment, and problem-solving would influence manufacturing for centuries. In the perseverance and ingenuity of medieval blacksmiths, we see humanity's enduring capacity to shape the world through skill, determination, and willingness to endure hardship in pursuit of mastery. The weight of the hammer told a story older than the cathedral bells, a story of calloused hands and stubborn iron, of generations bending over the same anvil while the world changed around them. At dawn, when mist still clung to the thatched roofs, the blacksmith's arms already ached with the memory of yesterday's labor. Each swing sent vibrations through muscle and bone, a physical chronicle of the medieval metalworker's existence. The forge was no place for the frail. Summer transformed it into a suffocating hellmouth where temperatures surpassed what human flesh could endure. Yet the work never stopped. Iron demanded precise heats, shaping while glowing malleable, quenching at exact moments. There was no negotiating with the laws of metal. A smith might collapse from heat stroke, but the work continued, for villages needed nails to hold homes together and plowshares to break hungry earth. Master Edmund, now in his 40s, ancient by medieval standards, bore the accumulated damage of 3 decades at the forge. His face resembled a battlefield, burns and scars mapping every miscalculation with molten metal. His eyebrows had vanished long ago, sacrificed to errant sparks. His hands told the cruelest tale, gnarled like oak roots, fingerprints erased by decades of gripping red-hot iron. The medieval blacksmith paid for his craft not in coin, but in flesh. The process of making even a simple nail revealed the trade's brutal poetry. First, heating an iron rod to cherry red in the forge, a task requiring the apprentice to pump giant bellows with his entire body weight until the coals roared white-hot. Then withdrawing the glowing metal with tongs, placing it on the anvil where the master's hammer would fall with precise, rhythmic blows. Each strike sent showers of sparks cascading like fiery rain, searing exposed skin with constellations of tiny burns. The rhythm was hypnotic yet punishing. Strike turn, shaping the iron before it cooled. But metal loses heat quickly, and if the work dragged, the piece had to be reheated, restarting the exhausting cycle. Every movement needed perfect efficiency, every hammer blow exact calculation. The blacksmith raced against time itself, for cooled iron was a stubbornest sin. The tools themselves were instruments of slow torture. The hammer, weighing 2 to 4 pounds, had to be wielded with precision for hours. By day's end, a smith's arm felt ready to detach from the shoulder, muscles knotted in agony. Tongs conducted heat along their lengths, burning hands already raw from handling hot metal. But the cruelest implement was the anvil, that hulking iron block positioned at back-breaking height. Leaning over it for years left most smiths permanently stooped, their spines compressed like accordions. Fire was a constant threat in a world built of wood and straw. A single stray spark could ignite the straw-covered workshop floor or the timber beams overhead. The village of Millbrook still bore scars from the Great Fire of 1241, when a careless smith let his forge burn too hot, consuming half the settlement. Such disasters haunted every blacksmith's nightmares. The smoke itself was a silent executioner. Medieval smiths developed a characteristic blacksmith's cough, a wet, rattling bark that spoke of lungs slowly filling with cold dust and metal filings. Few lived to see 50, their bodies worn down by heat, smoke, and ceaseless strain. Yet for all this suffering, the blacksmith held a position of strange reverence. Without his skills, medieval civilization would have unraveled. Farmers couldn't till fields without iron plowshares. Carpenters couldn't build without nails and hinges. Warriors couldn't fight without swords and armor. The blacksmith stood as the alchemist who transformed Earth's crude ore into the tools of survival. This importance granted blacksmiths a peculiar social standing, above common laborers but below merchants and nobility. They owned their tools, chose their projects, within limits, and often accumulated modest wealth. Yet their existence was marked by isolation. The forge's deafening noise made conversation impossible, the dangerous work demanded total focus, and most smiths labored alone but for their apprentices. This loneliness was compounded by superstition. In an age when most understood little of nature's workings, the ability to transform solid iron seemed almost supernatural. Some villagers eyed smiths with suspicion, wondering if their power over fire came from dark sources. Others sought them for charms and remedies unrelated to metalwork. A successful smith learned to cultivate just enough mystery to command respect, but not so much as to invite accusations of witchcraft. The apprenticeship system was institutionalized brutality. Boys as young as 12 were bound to masters for 7 years or more, effectively enslaved, working without pay in exchange for training. Young Thomas's life followed this ancient pattern, sleeping on the workshop floor with only a thin blanket against the stones, eating scraps after the master's family had died, working dawn to dusk with no hope of escape. Learning happened through pain. There were no manuals, no gentle guidance, just observation and the searing consequences of mistakes. A moment's inattention could mean crushed fingers or disfiguring burns. Many apprentices bore lifelong scars from their training years, marks that would whisper Smith to anyone who saw their hands. Economic realities were as harsh as the physical demands. While successful smiths could achieve modest prosperity, the path was fraught. Iron was expensive, requiring smiths to invest their meager resources before seeing returns. A single ruined piece meant financial disaster. Seasonal fluctuations meant feast or famine cycles, bursts of 18-hour days during planting and harvest, followed by winter months struggling to find work. Competition between smiths could be cutthroat, especially in towns with multiple workshops. Reputation was everything, taking years to build and moments to destroy. Guilds offered some protection, but imposed strict controls that limited innovation. A non-guild smith might find himself unable to work legally, while guild membership required fees many couldn't afford. As Thomas progressed through his apprenticeship, his body became a living record of the trade. His once smooth hands grew crossed with burns and cuts that charted his learning. His young back began curving toward the anvil's call. His lungs, once clear, developed the telltale wheeze that would haunt his remaining years. Yet he persisted, as thousands had before him, because blacksmithing offered one of the few paths out of peasantry for boys of humble birth. The alternative, a life as a serf bound to the land, offered even less dignity. The blacksmith's workshop was where Earth's raw materials became civilization's tools, but also where human bodies were tested beyond modern comprehension. It was a realm of fire and sacrifice, where progress was measured in suffering. As we leave young Thomas to his labors, we carry an understanding of medieval technology's true cost. Every nail, every horseshoe, every sword represented not just shaped iron, but shaped lives. Lives hardened and tempered like the metal they worked. The forge was indeed medieval civilization's beating heart, but one that pumped not just progress, but the very essence of human endurance. In the dancing flames and ringing anvils, we see reflected the broader medieval story, brutal, unforgiving, yet magnificent in its stubborn refusal to surrender to darkness. The struggles of these long-ago craftsmen have given way to a world where such suffering isn't required. But their legacy lives on whenever we shape metal, build tools, or create something lasting from raw materials. The medieval forge was a crucible where fire and human will collided, a place where men wrestled with the earth's stubborn elements, bending them to civilization's needs through sheer physical endurance. Each morning, as the first light crept over the village, the blacksmith engaged in an ancient ritual, coaxing life back into the forge's embers, preparing for another day of battle against unyielding metal. Young Thomas, now in his third year of apprenticeship, had developed the peculiar gait of his trade, a permanent slight stoop from years of bending over the anvil, his shoulders asymmetrically developed from wielding heavy hammers. His hands, once smooth and unscarred, now bore the topography of his profession, shiny burn marks like tiny lakes across a landscape of calluses, fingernails perpetually blackened from coal dust that no scrubbing could remove. The forge's heat was a living thing, an adversary that couldn't be reasoned with or escaped. In summer, the workshop became a vision of hell itself, temperatures soaring beyond human tolerance. Sweat evaporated before it could cool the skin, leaving white salt trails on grimy faces. Smiths developed tricks to endure, wrapping damp cloth around their necks, chewing mint leaves to trick their senses into feeling cooler, taking turns retreating to the workshop's marginally less infernal corners. Yet the work couldn't pause. Iron cared nothing for human discomfort. Master Edmund moved through this inferno with the weary grace of a man who'd made peace with suffering. His body told the story of 40 years at the forge. His forearms were speckled with smith's tattoos, tiny blue-black marks where slivers of hot metal had embedded themselves permanently under the skin. His left thumbnail was grotesquely thickened from years of accidental hammer blows. His knees popped audibly with every step, damaged from decades of bracing against the anvil's weight. Yet his hands still moved with surprising delicacy when needed, the gnarled fingers capable of adjusting a horseshoe's curve by fractions of an inch or sensing the exact moment when a blade needed quenching. The process of creating even basic tools revealed the astonishing complexity behind seemingly simple objects. Take the humble plowshare, the curved iron blade that allowed farmers to turn soil. To forge one required selecting iron with just the right carbon content. Too little and it would bend, too much and it would shatter. Heating it to precisely 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, judged not by instruments, but by the metal's color in the fire's glow. shaping it with carefully calculated hammer blows that compressed the metal's grain structure for strength, tempering it to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility, a process involving reheating and controlled cooling that could take days. All this for a tool that would spend its life being dragged through rocky soil, requiring constant repair and eventual replacement. The medieval blacksmith wasn't just a laborer. He was a materials scientist working without textbooks or precision instruments, his knowledge earned through decades of trial and catastrophic error. The workshop's dangers lurked everywhere. A misjudged hammer swing could send a red-hot metal sliver flying into an eye. The quenching trough's boiling water and oil mixture could scald flesh to the bone. A fatigued smith might grab the wrong end of tongs freshly pulled from the coals. Thomas bore scars from all these lessons. The most dramatic ran along his left forearm, a shiny rope of flesh where he'd brushed against a piece of metal fresh from the forge. That injury had cost him 2 weeks of work and nearly his position. For an apprentice who couldn't work was worse than useless. He was a drain on the master's resources. Yet for all its brutality, the forge also fostered profound camaraderie. The shared suffering created bonds stronger than the iron they shaped. Older smiths looked out for apprentices, teaching them tricks to avoid injury, rubbing tallow into their beards to prevent singeing, stuffing wool in their ears to dull the hammer's deafening ring, wrapping forearms in damp linen as makeshift heat protection. These small generational kindnesses formed an unspoken code, a recognition that the craft's survival depended on passing hard-won knowledge to the next generation, even as they competed for limited work. The blacksmith's economic position was equally paradoxical. While more prosperous than field laborers, a smith's wealth was precarious. His prosperity depended on the local harvest, which determined farmers' ability to pay for tool repairs, the lord's military ambitions, which might bring weapon commissions or conscription, the village's stability. A single fire could destroy both his workshop and customer base. A successful medieval smith might own 2 or 3 good hammers, a set of tongs in various sizes, a small stockpile of iron bars, perhaps a spare anvil. This represented capital unimaginable to a peasant, yet it could vanish overnight through bad luck or a nobleman's whim. The psychological toll was perhaps the hardest burden. The blacksmith's work demanded constant, unrelenting focus. A moment's distraction could mean ruining a day's work by overheating metal, destroying expensive materials, causing grievous injury to oneself or an apprentice. This mental strain manifested in ways medieval people didn't understand: chronic fatigue, sudden bursts of anger, the inability to sleep despite exhaustion. Modern medicine would recognize these as symptoms of prolonged stress and sleep deprivation, but to Edmund's generation, it was simply the blacksmith's melancholy. Yet in this cauldron of suffering, something remarkable emerged: the transformation of raw human potential into refined skill. Thomas, who 3 years earlier couldn't tell wrought iron from cast, could now judge a metal's temperature within 50 degrees Fahrenheit by its color, hear flaws in a blade from the ring of his hammer, feel when a weld was true through vibrations in the tongs. This hard-won expertise came at tremendous cost, but it granted something peasants rarely achieved: a sense of mastery over one's destiny. However brutal the forge, it was a place where skill mattered more than birth, where a serf's son could become a respected craftsman through sheer determination. As evening fell and the forge's glow dimmed, Thomas would often pause to watch villagers returning from the fields, their backs bent from dawn till dusk, their lives measured in seasons of planting and harvest. However hard his apprenticeship, he knew the alternative was harder still. The forge's fire might burn his flesh, but it also forged his future. The morning frost still clung to the thatched roofs when Thomas heard the first cough. Not the usual blacksmith's rasp. This was wetter, deeper, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. Master Edmund leaned against the anvil, his face ashen in the forge's glow. "Stop gawking, boy," he wheezed, wiping blood-flecked spittle with the back of his hand. "The Reeves gate won't forge itself." Thomas knew better than to argue. He'd seen this before. the way master smiths worked until their lungs gave out. He stoked the fire silently, watching embers swirl upward like reverse snowfall. The workshop smelled different that morning, not just of burning charcoal and hot metal, but of the turnip stew Mistress Agnes had left simmering overnight, her unspoken admission that Edmund wouldn't last the winter. "Your hammer's off rhythm," Edmund snapped as Thomas shaped the hinge's pivot. "Like this." His gnarled hands guided Thomas's, the old man's fingers trembling with effort. Together they struck, clang, the perfect note resonating through the frozen air. A memory surfaced. Thomas at 12, flinching from his first spark burn. Edmund had pressed the boy's blistered finger into fresh snow. "Remember this sting," he'd growled. "Metal respects no one." Now the pupil watched the master's breath come in shallow gasps between hammer blows. Each strike cost Edmund dearly, yet he refused to yield the hammer. Not for this. The Reeves ceremonial gait that would outlive them both. By midday, the cough worsened. Thomas caught Edmund clutching his chest after bending to retrieve a dropped tongue. The old man's lips moved soundlessly. A prayer or curse, it was hard to tell. "Let me finish the scroll work," Thomas offered. Edmund's glare could still make apprentices tremble. "You'll botch the tempering." He plunged the glowing metal into the quenching trough. Steam erupted with a hiss like a dying serpent. Outside, the village continued unaware. The baker's daughter delivered rye bread, pausing to admire the unfolding iron vines. The miller's boy brought news of a frozen creek upstream. Ordinary moments threading through their last shared creation. As twilight painted the snow blue, Edmund finally surrendered his hammer. His hands, usually so sure, fumbled with the workshop's latch. Mind the hinge pin doesn't. A coughing fit bent him double. When he straightened, his eyes held the same defeated glaze Thomas had seen in overworked plow horses. Thomas finished the sentence silently. "Doesn't cool too fast, or the grain will fracture." He waited until Edmund's shuffling footsteps faded into the winter dark before adding his own mark. A single oak leaf amid the iron vines. No one would notice but him. The forge fire burned lower now, its light catching the hundreds of tiny scars on Thomas's arms, each a lesson etched in pain. Outside, the first true snow began to fall, muting the world beyond their circle of heat and hammer songs. The first snowflake landed on the anvil with a hiss. Thomas watched it vanish into steam, like all his childhood winters had melted away under the forge's unrelenting heat. He flexed his aching fingers. The right one still wouldn't straighten properly after last month's quenching accident. Old Nan's voice carried from the tavern across the square. "That new smith's got hands like the devil's own tongs." Her cackle sent chickens scattering. Thomas smiled grimly. At 19, he'd become what the village needed, the last working smith after Edmund's passing. The workshop smelled different now. Less of Edmund's herb poultices, more of Thomas's own sweat, and the sharp tang of the better quality iron he could finally afford. The ghost of his master still haunted every corner. In the chipped corner of the anvil where Edmund had missed a strike in 78. In the warped floorboard that still creaked under imaginary footsteps at midnight. Most of all, in the ledger where Thomas now kept accounts, his letters awkward and childish beside Edmund's elegant script. A commotion at the door. Young Will, the miller's son, panting like he'd run through hell itself. Master Thomas, the Lord's men-at-arms. The rest was drowned out by the clatter of hooves. 3 riders in half-armor dismounted, their spurs jingling like death bells. The tallest removed his helm, revealing a face Thomas knew too well, Sir Gerald's old squire, now wearing a knight's chain. "Smith." The man's voice carried the bored cruelty of someone used to being obeyed. "We need 6 lance heads by Michaelmas." Thomas wiped his hands slowly on his apron. The old defiance rose in his throat like bile. Last spring, this same man had kicked over his quenching trough for sport. "My lord knows my prices." A gauntlet fist slammed onto his workbench. "You'll take what's offered." The silence stretched. Thomas studied the knight's armor. Poorly maintained straps, rust blooming at the joints. He reached slowly for his smallest hammer, watching the man's eyes track its movement. "I could repair that right pauldron for you," Thomas said softly. before it fails in battle. The change was instant. The night's bluster evaporated like morning dew on hot iron. Thomas hid his smile. This dance he knew, the same one Edmund had taught him through example. Fear might make men obey, but need made them humble. As the riders departed with grudging respect, Thomas turned back to his forge. The tools felt different in his hands now, no longer borrowed, but truly his. He ran a thumb along the hammer's worn handle, finding the groove where Edmund's fingers had rested for 30 years. The first lance head took shape under his practiced blows, the metal singing its familiar song. Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing the village in temporary peace. Somewhere beyond the forest, armies gathered like storm clouds. But here, in this circle of heat and sparks, one young smith held the power to shape more than just iron. The first spring storm rolled over Millbrook like a drunken blacksmith knocking over his tools, violent, unpredictable, and leaving everything changed in its wake. Thomas stood in the workshop doorway, watching rain sheet across the village square, turning the dirt paths into bubbling brown streams that carried away winter's last stubborn patches of snow. The forge behind him breathed heat against his back, its familiar rhythms interrupted by the weather's tantrum. He could hear the fire whispering to him, that siren call every smith knew, the urge to keep working despite the storm, to lose himself in the dance of hammer and glowing metal. But his hands, scarred veterans of 5 hard years at the anvil, trembled slightly at the thought. The ghost of Edmund's voice rasped in his memory. A tired smith is a dead smith. A sudden gust hurled raindrops like handfuls of pebbles against the workshop's shuttered windows. Somewhere in the storm's howl, Thomas imagined he heard the old man's cough, that wet, ragged sound that had punctuated his final winter. Shaking off the memory, he turned back to his unfinished work, a commission from the new priest, an iron crucifix for the church's rebuilt sacristy. The design was simple, but the weight of it sat heavy in his chest. Father Anselm had been specific. Make it strong enough to last generations, Thomas. Like faith itself. The irony wasn't lost on him. The village atheist forging symbols of devotion. His reverie shattered as the door burst open, admitting a drenched figure trailing mud and rainwater. Little Meg, the tavern keeper's daughter, stood shaking like a leaf in a gale, her usually vibrant red braids darkened to blood brown by the storm. "They're coming," she gasped, clutching her side. "Bandits." Torched Miller's Creek at dawn. Thomas's hammer slipped from suddenly numb fingers, striking the stone floor with a clang that echoed through the workshop. The storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. How many? 20, maybe 30. Meg's eyes darted to the unfinished crucifix. They've got a blacksmith with them, breaking into every shop for weapons. The unspoken truth hung between them like the iron cross suspended over Thomas's anvil. A captured smith could mean the difference between a village surviving or burning. Thomas's gaze fell on the row of farming tools lining his walls, each one a potential weapon in desperate hands. The storm renewed its assault as Thomas moved methodically through the workshop, his motions precise despite the adrenaline singing in his veins. He banked the forge fire carefully. Too much heat left unattended could doom the whole village. His tools went into the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, the one Edmund had shown him during the rebellion of '81. "Take these to Father Anselm," he said, pressing a bundle of wrapped files into Meg's shaking hands. "Tell him to melt them down for nails, if need be." Her small hand closed around his wrist. "You're not staying." It wasn't a question. Thomas looked past her to the square where the first tendrils of smoke were beginning to rise beyond the thatched roofs. The metallic tang of impending violence mixed with the petrichor rising from soaked earth. "I'll lead them to the old quarry," he said, strapping on Edmund's old traveling apron, stiff with age and hardened by decades of sparks. The narrow pass will. A horn blast cut through the storm's fury, closer than expected. Too close. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs like a frantic prisoner. In that suspended moment, he noticed absurd details. Rainwater dripping from Meg's nose onto the freshly swept floor. The way his own reflection warped in a hanging strip of polished steel. the faint smell of burnt porridge from this morning's breakfast still clinging to his shirt. The first scream tore through the village, high-pitched and terrible. Thomas seized the heavy iron door pull, muscles straining as he swung the oak barrier shut. The bar fell into place with a finality that echoed in his bones. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent. Inside the workshop's protective gloom, Thomas pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the anvil, drawing strength from the silent witness that had seen generations of smiths through darker days than this. Somewhere beneath his feet, the earth seemed to pulse in time with the forge's fading heartbeat. When he lifted his head, his eyes fell on the unfinished crucifix. With sudden clarity, he reached for his hammer, not the delicate one meant for scrollwork, but Edmund's old war hammer, its massive head pitted from decades of service. The weight felt right in his hands, balanced like truth itself. Right then, Thomas murmured to the empty workshop, to the ghosts of all the smiths who'd stood where he stood, "Let's see what this metal's really made of." The storm answered with a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the village. Somewhere beyond the workshop's walls, destiny waited, not with a blacksmith's measured patience, but with the hungry impatience of a forge fire stoked too hot. The quarry road twisted like a wounded serpent beneath Thomas's boots, each turned sharper than the last. Behind him, the village shrank into the storm's maw, its thatched roofs now just smudges of brown against the lashing rain. He'd left the main path a quarter-mile back, taking instead the old drover's track that wound through blackthorn thickets. Every few steps, he paused to listen, his calloused fingers tightening around the warhammer's haft. The bandits' torches flickered in the distance, bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps through the downpour. 30 men, maybe more. Thomas counted at least 4 crossbows from their silhouettes. His stomach nodded. This was no ordinary raiding party. That many armed men spoke of a warlord's backing. A rock shifted underfoot, sending a pebble skittering down the slope. Thomas froze. The scent of wet earth and crushed ferns filled his nose, undercut with something metallic. Fierce sweat or blood, he couldn't tell. Somewhere ahead, water dripped steadily into a hidden pool, its rhythm at odds with his pounding heart. Then he heard it, the sound that turned his blood to ice. Clink, clink, clink. The unmistakable ring of a smith's hammer on hot iron. Thomas edged forward, pressing against the quarry's moss-slick walls. Through a gap in the brambles, he saw the bandits' makeshift camp, a dozen bedrolls arranged around a roaring fire. And at its center, working the bellows of a portable forge, stood a figure that made his breath catch. "Christ preserve us," he whispered. The bandit smith wasn't some pressed village craftsman, as he'd assumed. It was a woman, taller than most men, her hair cropped short as any soldier's. She moved between anvil and fire with the lethal grace of a she-wolf. The orange glow lit the sweat-slicked planes of her face, revealing a latticework of scars running from cheekbone to jaw, the mark of a shattered visor in some long-ago battle. Thomas's professional eye noted the precision of her work even as his gut churned. She was reforging farming tools into weapons, his own well-crafted hoe blades becoming cruel, curved daggers. The realization struck like a hammer blow. This was no ordinary bandit. This was Eleanor the Sundered, the mercenary smith who disappeared after the Northern Wars. Legend said she could temper a blade in blood and make it unbreakable. A child's whimper snapped his attention left. 3 village boys, couldn't be older than 12, sat bound near the fire, their faces swollen with fresh bruises. The miller's twins and old Cobb's grandson. Thomas's nails bit into his palms. These were the bait. Eleanor lifted a glowing dagger blade with tongs, examining the edge. "Still too soft," she announced to no one in particular. Her voice carried the rasp of someone who'd inhaled too much forged smoke. "These southern irons lack spine." One of the bandits laughed. "We'll find you better metal soon enough, Ellie." Whole village full of it. Thomas's mind raced. He'd come to lead them away, not stage some fool rescue. But those boys. The decision crystallized when Eleanor dunked the blade into a trough. Not water, but dark liquid that steamed and hissed. The coppery scent hit Thomas's nostrils even across the clearing. Blood tempering. The old forbidden technique Edmund had warned about, where quenching hot steel and living blood supposedly made it hunger for more. His boot found a loose stone. It clattered down the slope, bouncing off an outcrop with the subtlety of a church bell. Every head in the clearing snapped up. For one suspended moment, Thomas saw himself reflected in Eleanor's eyes, a rain-soaked figure haloed in storm light, hammer raised not in threat, but in some strange salute between craftsmen. Recognition flashed between them, swift and terrible as lightning. Then chaos erupted. Thomas barely dodged the first crossbow bolt. It sparked off the quarry wall behind him, sending limestone shards flying. He charged downhill, using the slope's momentum, the war hammer singing through the rain. "To me, lads," he roared, praying the boys had sense enough to run. Eleanor moved faster. Her reforged dagger flashed as she cut the nearest boy's bonds with one hand while snatching up a smith's punch with the other. The children scattered like quail. Thomas barreled into the first bandit, feeling ribs crack under the hammer's blunt end. The man crumpled with a wet cough. Another came at him with a woodsman's axe, poorly balanced, the edge notched from misuse. Thomas sidestepped, letting momentum carry the fool into the forge. The scream that followed smelled of burnt hair and pork. Then Eleanor was upon him. Her first strike came low, not at as hard as he'd expected, but at his hammer hand. The smith's punch struck his wrist with surgical precision. Numbness radiated up his arm. The war hammer thudded into mud. "Kneel," she commanded, pressing the blood-tempered dagger to his throat. Its edge burned where it touched skin. Thomas spat at her feet. "I don't kneel to butchers." Something flickered in those furnace-bright eyes. Not anger. Something far more dangerous. Curiosity. She leaned closer, her breath hot against his ear despite the chill rain. "You've the look of Edmund's boy," she murmured, so low only he could hear. "He ever teach you the threefold weld?" The question threw him. The threefold weld was an ancient technique, said to join metals so seamlessly they became one. Edmund had mentioned it only once, calling it more prayer than craft. Thomas met her gaze. He said no honest smith needs it. Eleanor's lips peeled back from teeth filed sharp as any wolf's. "Then today you'll learn why dishonest ones do." Behind them, the bandits regrouped. Thomas saw the calculation in Eleanor's stance. She could kill him now, or the choice was taken from them both. A new sound cut through the rain's drumbeat. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming hard from the village direction. The Baron's banner snapped at the head of the column, its black boar stark against storm-gray skies. Eleanor's dagger vanished as if it had never been. She melted backward into the quarry's shadows, pausing only to kick the war hammer toward Thomas. "Tell your master's ghost," she called over her shoulder. "The anvil still rings." Then she was gone, her bandits scattering after her like sparks from a struck flint. The Baron's men thundered past in pursuit, their lances gleaming wetly. None noticed the smith crouched in the rocks, clutching his numb wrist, watching as the rain washed traces of blood from the abandoned forge. Only when silence returned did Thomas rise. The boys were safe. The village would never know how close death had come. And somewhere in the darkening woods, a renegade smith carried secrets that could unmake kingdoms. He retrieved his hammer, its head now caked with mud and something darker. The walk back to Millbrook would be long, and the crucifix still needed finishing. But first, he knelt by the cooling forge. With his good hand, Thomas traced the marks left in the anvil, not the haphazard dents of bandit work, but the precise, concentric strikes of a master craftswoman. The pattern was unmistakable. Eleanor had been making more than daggers. Embedded in the anvil's face, almost too small to notice, lay a perfect iron rose, its petals folded from the same steel as the reforged blades. A craftsman's signature, a wolf's calling card, and unless Thomas missed his guess, a declaration of war. The workshop smelled of lilacs. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his rain-soaked clothes dripping onto the freshly swept floor. The scent shouldn't be here, not in this masculine realm of hot metal and coal smoke. Yet it hung unmistakable in the air, cutting through the familiar odors of sweat and iron like a blade through rotten cloth. Then he saw her, Eleanor the Sundered sat perched on his anvil like some dark-feathered bird of prey, her booted feet swinging just above the floor. She'd changed clothes since the quarry, now wearing a travel-stained tunic that might have once been blue, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and dotted with old burns. The same pattern as his own. "You took your time," she remarked, picking at a bowl of stew that hadn't been on his table when he left. "I ate your supper. Hope you don't mind." Thomas's fingers twitched toward the hammer still slung at his belt. The iron rose she'd left in the quarry now sat atop his tool chest, its petals catching the firelight in ways that made them seem almost alive. "How?" His voice came out hoarse. He tried again. "How did you get past the Baron's men?" Eleanor's laugh was low and rough, like two files rubbing together. "Same way I got past your lock." She held up a twisted piece of metal, his own door pin, bent beyond recognition. "You should teach that village girl of yours better security. She nearly stabbed me with a spoon." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Meg." He lunged forward, forgetting caution. "If you've touched her." "Peace, Edmund's boy." Eleanor raised both hands, the left one missing its pinky finger at the knuckle. "I'm not here for blood. Not today." She slid off the anvil with a grace that belied her size, landing lightly despite the armored boots. "Though you might want to check your quenching trough." Thomas edged sideways, keeping her in sight as he peered into the water barrel. 3 crossbow bolts floated there, their heads carefully wrapped in oilcloth to mute the telltale splash. All aimed at where he normally stood while working. "You missed the 4th, Eleanor said conversationally. "Up in the rafters." Thomas didn't bother looking. His throat tightened. These weren't random shots. Someone had studied his habits, knew his routines. "Baron's men." Eleanor snorted. "Please." Those fools couldn't hit a barn from the inside. She began pacing the workshop, running fingers over tools with a craftsman's appreciation. "No, these were professionals." "Which means?" "The church," Thomas finished, watching as she picked up his favorite hammer. The one Edmund had made for his 16th birthday. Eleanor tested its balance with a practiced swing. "Smart lad. Seems your little crucifix commission raised some eyebrows." She nodded toward the unfinished work. "Father Anselm's been asking questions about certain discrepancies in the parish ledgers." Thomas's mind raced. The priest had seemed genuinely pious when commissioning the piece. But now he remembered the man's odd insistence on specific dimensions, the strange interest in how much the iron would weigh. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're smuggling something in religious artifacts. Something that needs precise weight distributions to go unnoticed." She replaced the hammer exactly where she'd found it. "And you, my dear boy, just built them the perfect hiding place." Outside, an owl hooted, once, twice. Eleanor's head snapped up. "Time's up." She moved to the window, her silhouette blending unnaturally with the shadows. "They'll come for you at dawn. Probably burn the place for good measure." Thomas found his hands had clenched into fists without his noticing. "Why warn me?" For the first time, Eleanor's mask slipped. Something like pain flickered across those scarred features. "Because I knew your master. Fought beside him at Brenna Pass." She touched the ruined cheek. "This came from saving my fool life when our own side turned on us." The revelation hit like a hammer blow. Thomas had been at Edmund's side when the old man died. Not a word about Brenna, about mercenary work, about saving anyone. Just instructions about annealing temperatures and where to find the hidden money pouch. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. "He wouldn't have told you. That wasn't his way." She reached into her tunic and tossed something onto the anvil. A small iron pendant shaped like a hammer within a circle. "We called ourselves the Forgeborn. Still do, those of us left." Thomas picked up the pendant. It was warm from her skin, the metal worn smooth by years of handling. On closer inspection, he realized this circle was actually a serpent eating its own tail. "A warning," Eleanor said, already fading into the darkness near the door. "What we make can unmake us." Thomas's mind whirled with questions, but the words that came out were, "The threefold welt." What is it really? Eleanor paused, her hand on the doorframe. Moonlight caught the edge of her profile, making the scars gleam silver. "Not what? Who?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The technique died at Brenna Pass, along with the man who invented it." What's left is just shadows pretending to be steel. Then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lilacs and the pendant burning a hole in Thomas's palm. He stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer by, the forge's last embers sighed as they collapsed into ash. Then Thomas moved with sudden purpose. He banked the fire properly, gathered his best tools into the hidden compartment, and took down Edmund's old traveling cloak from its peg. The crucifix could wait. As he stepped into the moonlit yard, a glint near the well caught his eye. 3 figures stood at the village edge, their dark robes fluttering like ravens' wings despite the lack of wind. Even at this distance, Thomas could make out the glint of metal at their waists. Not swords, but the distinctive curved blades of ecclesiastical assassins. The pendant in his hand seemed to grow heavier. Whatever game was afoot, the pieces were moving faster now. Somewhere out in the darkness, Eleanor the Sundered carried secrets that could get them both killed. And Father Anselm. Thomas touched the hammer at his belt, taking comfort in its familiar weight. Dawn was coming. The church's assassins were coming, and he'd be damned if he'd faced them unprepared. The forest smelled of damp earth and impending frost as Thomas picked his way through the undergrowth. Every crunch of leaves beneath his boots sounding louder than a church bell in the pre-dawn hush. He'd taken the old charcoal burner's path, the one Edmund had shown him when he was 12 and needed to hide a broken ale cask from the village reeve. His breath fogged in the cold air as he paused beside a lightning-blasted oak, its blackened trunk split down the middle like a poorly forged blade. Somewhere ahead, water gurgled, the mill stream that marked the boundary between Millbrook's lands and the wilds beyond. Beyond that lay Brenna Pass and Answers. Thomas adjusted the straps of his pack, feeling the weight of his stolen crucifix digging into his shoulder blades. He'd taken it from the church sacristy on his way out of town, ignoring Father Anselm's startled gasp as he smashed the ornate base against the stone floor. The hollow clang had confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. The damned thing was packed with something dense and metallic. A twig snapped to his left. Thomas froze, his hand drifting to the hammer at his belt. The woods had gone eerily silent. No owl calls, no rustling of small creatures in the brush. Only the steady drip of condensation from the trees. Then he saw it, a glint of metal among the ferns. Not the dull sheen of a lost plowshare, but the oily gleam of polished steel catching first light. He dropped to one knee just as the crossbow bolt whizzed overhead, embedding itself in the oak with a meaty thunk. 3 more bolts followed in rapid succession, stitching a line across the tree trunk at chest height. Professional work. Show yourself, Smith. A voice rang out from the trees, cultured, educated, utterly out of place in these woods. We only want what you stole. Thomas pressed his back against the scarred oak, fingers tightening around his hammer. The pendant Eleanor had given him burned against his chest like a brand. He'd known the church would send hunters, but this fast? A shadow detached itself from the tree line. A tall figure in traveler's gray, his face obscured by a hood. The crossbow in his hands was no peasant weapon, but a sleek Verratti repeater worth more than Thomas's entire workshop. You don't even know what you're carrying, do you? The man's voice dripped condescension. That's always the way with you craftsmen. So proud of your little creations, never seeing the larger patterns. Thomas's mind raced. The crucifix weighed heavy in his pack, its contents shifting slightly with each movement. He'd risked everything to steal it, and now this stranger wanted to. The realization hit like a hammer blow. You're not with the church, Thomas breathed. The hooded man froze mid-step. Thomas pressed his advantage. They wouldn't send one man, and they certainly wouldn't waste time talking. He hefted his hammer, feeling the balance settle into his wrist. Who are you really? For a long moment, the only sound was the stream's murmur and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, with a sigh, the stranger pushed back his hood, revealing a face that made Thomas's blood run cold. Dark eyes, sharp cheekbones, and running from temple to jaw, a latticework of scars identical to Eleanor's. Marcus of Hyrock, the man said, his voice suddenly weary. Last of the Forgeborn. He lowered the crossbow. And if you want to live to see sunset, You'll hand over what you stole from that lying priest." Thomas's grip on the hammer didn't loosen. Eleanor said, "Eleanor talks too much." Marcus spat into the leaves. "She always did." He gestured with the crossbow. "Now are you going to give me that thrice-damned box? Or do I have to shoot you through the kneecap first?" Thomas hesitated. Every instinct screamed that this man was dangerous. More dangerous than Eleanor. More dangerous than the church assassins. But something in those scarred hands, in the way he held the crossbow like a man more accustomed to hammers. With slow movements, Thomas shrugged off his pack and extracted the broken crucifix. The hollow base had cracked open during his flight, revealing a small iron box nestled inside, its surface covered in strange markings that seemed to shift in the dim light. Marcus's breath caught. "God's teeth," he whispered. "She actually found it." Thomas turned the box in his hands, the metal unnaturally cold against his skin. The markings weren't random scratches as he'd first thought, but tiny, precise letters in some forgotten script. And at the center, barely larger than a nailhead, was a depression shaped like a hammer. Thomas realized aloud. "It needs the pendant." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Give it here." A branch cracked somewhere downstream. Both men turned as one, years of battlefield instinct overriding their standoff. The forest had gone silent again, too silent. "They're here," Marcus hissed, suddenly at Thomas's side. His crossbow came up, trained on the tree line. Church hounds. At least 6. Thomas barely had time to register the man's sudden shift in allegiance before the first arrow hissed past his ear. Marcus's crossbow sang in response, followed by a choked cry from the undergrowth. "Run, you fool." Marcus shoved Thomas toward the stream while reloading with practiced speed. "Take the box to Eleanor at Brenna's ruins. She'll know what to." An arrow took him in the throat. Marcus staggered, his hands flying to the shaft protruding from his neck. Blood welled between his fingers, dark as old iron. His lips moved soundlessly as he collapsed to his knees. One last message trying to force its way past the ruin of his windpipe. Thomas didn't wait to decipher it. He ran. The stream's icy water shocked the breath from his lungs as he plunged across, the box clutched tight against his chest. Arrows peppered the water around him, one grazing his shoulder with a fiery kiss. He scrambled up the far bank, slipping on wet leaves, his hammer bouncing against his thigh. Behind him, shouts echoed through the trees, cries in a language Thomas didn't recognize, but whose meaning was clear enough. They were coming. The rising sun painted the forest in gold and crimson as Thomas fled deeper into the wilds, the iron box's secrets burning a hole in his soul. Somewhere ahead lay Brenna Pass and whatever waited there. Behind him, death followed in silent footsteps. And in his heart, a single question hammered louder than all the rest. What had Edmund truly been? The ruins of Brenna Pass rose from the morning mist like the broken teeth of some long-dead giant. Thomas staggered the last few yards up the scree slope, his boots slipping on frost-slick stones, the iron box clutched to his chest like a stolen child. Blood from his arrow wound had seeped through his makeshift bandage, painting a dark Rorschach blot across his tunic that seemed to shift patterns with every labored breath. He collapsed against a fallen column, its weathered surface carved with symbols that made his eyes ache to look upon. Not Christian crosses or saintly icons, but angular marks that resembled nothing so much as hammer strikes frozen in stone. The wind howled through the pass with a voice too sharp for nature, carrying whispers that might have been words if only he could. Took you long enough. Eleanor emerged from the ruins like a shadow given form, her cropped hair crusted with old blood, her armor pieced together from mismatched plates that somehow fit together with brutal efficiency. She held out a water skin without ceremony. "Drink. You look like Death's apprentice." Thomas swallowed greedily, the liquid inside burning his throat. Not water, but some harsh liquor that tasted of pine resin and forge coals. He coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Marcus is dead. Eleanor's face didn't change, but her grip on the water skin tightened until the leather creaked. "How?" "Church archers. They're maybe an hour behind me." Thomas pressed the iron box into her hands, its strange markings glowing faintly in the dawn light. "He said you'd know what to do with this." For the first time since he'd met her, Eleanor looked uncertain. Her fingers traced the depression at the box's center, the hammer-shaped indentation that matched the pendant now warm against Thomas's chest. "You shouldn't have come here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "This place, it remembers." A gust of wind screamed through the pass, carrying with it the distant clang of metal on stone. Not the random tumble of ruins settling, but the deliberate, rhythmic strike of a smith at work. Thomas's head snapped up. "We're not alone." Eleanor's smile held no warmth. "Never were." She jerked her chin toward the heart of the ruins. "Come meet your master's ghosts." The path wound downward into the mountain's belly, the air growing thicker with each step, not with damp or decay, but with the acrid tang of a working forge. The scent grew until Thomas could taste it on his tongue, that peculiar mix of hot metal and coal smoke that had been the backdrop of his entire life. Then they rounded a corner, and the world dropped away. The cavern stretched wider than Millbrook's entire square, its ceiling lost in shadows. Dozens of forges dotted the space, some cold and abandoned, others glowing with fresh heat. Figures moved between them, men and women in soot-stained leathers, their faces hidden behind hinged masks that reflected the firelight in grotesque patterns. But it was the centerpiece that stole Thomas's breath, an anvil the size of a burial slab, its surface polished to a mirror sheen by countless hammer blows. And standing over it, a massive figure in blackened plate armor worked a length of glowing metal with blows that sent sparks dancing across the stone floor. "Brenna's heart," Eleanor whispered, "where the last true smiths made their stand." As if sensing their presence, the armored smith turned. The mask he wore was no simple face covering, but a masterwork of articulated steel shaped into the visage of a snarling wolf. When he spoke, his voice emerged distorted, metallic, the sound of a sword being drawn from its scabbard. "You brought the key." Not a question, a statement. Eleanor stepped forward, holding out the iron box. "And the key bearer." She gestured to Thomas. "Edmund's apprentice." A murmur ran through the gathered smiths. The wolf-masked figure straightened to his full height, near 7 feet tall, in his armored boots. He reached up with hands the size of trenchers and removed his mask. Thomas's knees nearly buckled. The face beneath was human, barely, scarred beyond recognition. One eye milky white, the other a startling blue that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But it was the man's right hand that held Thomas transfixed. 3 fingers fused together by old burns, the remaining digits ending in crude metal caps that gleamed like polished steel. "Boy," the smith rumbled, his ruined face attempting something that might have been a smile. "You've your master's stubborn chin." Thomas's voice deserted him. This wasn't just another forge-born. This was the legend himself. Gareth Ironhand, the Smith King who'd held Brenna Pass against an army during the Schism Wars. The man Edmund had spoken of only once, in hushed tones over winter ale. The man who was supposed to be dead. Gareth reached for the box, his metal-capped fingers clicking against its surface. "The church thinks this holds relics." His laugh sounded like an avalanche of scrap metal. "Fools. What's inside makes their holy trinkets look like children's toys." He pressed his deformed hand against the central depression. The markings flared crimson, lines of fire racing across the surface until the entire box glowed like metal fresh from the forge. With a hiss like a quenching blade, the lid sprang open. Thomas expected gold, jewels, perhaps some heretical scripture. What he saw instead made his stomach lurch. A single, perfect feather, its veins shimmering with colors no earthly bird could produce. It shifted between hues as he watched. One moment the deep blue of tempered steel, the next the angry red of fresh iron pulled from the coals. Gareth lifted it with surprising delicacy. The phoenix shard, last remnant of the first forge. His glowing eye fixed on Thomas. "And your master's life's work." The cavern seemed to tilt around Thomas. "Edmund made this." "Not made." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Discovered. Hidden in plain sight within every forge's fire, if you know how to look." Gareth nodded. "For centuries, the church has sought to control it, to bend its power to their will." His massive shoulders sagged. Your master stole it back from them, paid with his life to get it to safety. Thomas's mind reeled. All those years of mundane work, shoeing horses, mending plows, while this cosmic secret burned in their very hearth. The implications crashed over him like a blacksmith's quenching wave. Edmund's odd insistence on certain prayers before lighting the forge. The way he'd sometimes stare into the flames for hours. That last, cryptic whisper as he lay dying, "Mind the spark." A horn blast echoed through the cavern, shattering the moment. Eleanor swore viciously. "They're here." Gareth's face hardened. He carefully replaced the feather in its box and pressed it into Thomas's hands. "This belongs to the Forgeborn, to those who understand fire's true nature." His glowing eye bored into Thomas's soul. "Will you stand with us, Edmund's heir?" Outside, steel clashed against steel. The church's hunters had found their prey. Thomas looked down at the box, its markings pulsing faintly against his palms. Somewhere in its depths, the phoenix shard sang a song only he could hear, a melody of hammer and anvil, of fire and rebirth. He reached for his hammer, feeling its familiar weight ground him. Where do we begin? Gareth's answering grin split his ruined face like a crack in old iron. "At the beginning, boy." He gestured to the massive central anvil. "With the first strike." As Thomas stepped forward, the cavern's shadows seemed to deepen around the gathered smiths, the very air vibrating with potential. The church's soldiers would come. There would be blood and fire and choices that could never be unmade. But for this one suspended moment, there was only the hammer's song and the knowledge that every strike, from the first to the last, shaped the world in ways both seen and unseen. The first hammer strike echoed through Brenna Pass like the crack of the world's bones breaking. Thomas brought the massive forging hammer down with all his strength, its head engraved with the same serpent eating its tail symbol as Eleanor's pendant, connecting with the phoenix shard in a shower of golden sparks. The impact traveled up his arms like lightning, vibrating through his teeth and rattling his ribcage. For one terrifying instant, he thought he'd shattered it. Then the feather moved, not bending as metal should, but flowing, the shimmering veins stretching and twisting like molten glass beneath his blows. The cavern's shadows stretched long and thin, the very air trembling as if the mountain itself held its breath. Again, Gareth bellowed over the growing wind, his metal-capped fingers tightening on Thomas's shoulder. "Strike true, boy." Outside the cavern mouth, the clash of steel grew louder. Eleanor and the other Forgeborn had formed a bristling perimeter, their makeshift weapons gleaming dully in the firelight. Thomas caught glimpses of black-robed figures darting at the edges of vision, ecclesiastical assassins moving with unnatural grace. He raised the hammer again, his muscles screaming in protest. The second strike landed with a sound like 100 anvils ringing in unison. The feather flattened, its colors deepening to the rich purple of tempered steel. Something shifted in the cavern's atmosphere, a pressure change that made Thomas's ears pop. The torches flickered wildly, their flames stretching toward the central anvil as if drawn by some invisible force. "Third strike seals the pact," Gareth intoned, his voice taking on a ceremonial cadence. "What is sundered must be remade." Thomas's arms trembled as he lifted the hammer for the final blow. The phoenix shard pulsed in time with his heartbeat, its rhythm accelerating as if sensing his intent. Through the cavern entrance, he saw Eleanor fall back under a flurry of attacks, her armor slick with blood. The hammer descended. Time fractured. The instant the hammerhead touched the feather, Thomas's vision whited out. A soundless explosion rippled outward, sending shockwaves through stone and flesh alike. He felt rather than saw the Forgeborn stagger, their weapons falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The church assassins fared worse, their black robes bursting into sapphire flames that consumed without burning. When Thomas's sight returned, the phoenix shard floated above the anvil, spinning slowly like a child's top. Its form had changed, no longer a feather but a teardrop of pure light, its surface covered in minuscule runes that shifted too quickly for the eye to follow. Gareth sank to one knee, his breathing ragged. "It's done," he rasped. "The pact is renewed." Thomas barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the glowing teardrop and the visions it cast upon the cavern walls. Shadows moved within the light, resolving into scenes from some unimaginable past. A towering figure hammering at a star suspended over an anvil. A great city of glass and steel crumbling into dust. Dozens of men and women in familiar leather aprons, their hammers rising and falling in perfect unison. Most haunting of all, a younger Edmund, his face unlined, standing before this very anvil with the same awe Thomas now felt. The visions shifted again, showing the present. Church soldiers regrouping at the pass entrance, their leader, a skeletal figure in cardinal's robes, raising a twisted staff topped with a blackened iron cross. "They're not finished," Thomas gasped. Gareth followed his gaze and swore. "Malachi," the name dripped with venom, Archbishop of the Smoldering Sea. He struggled to rise, his armor creaking. "He means to corrupt the shard." Thomas watched in horror as the skeletal archbishop began an incantation, his staff glowing with sickly green light. Where the glow touched stone, the rock itself withered like rotten fruit. Eleanor stumbled to Thomas's side, her left arm hanging uselessly, her right still gripping a bloodied hammer. "The shard needs a vessel," she panted. "Something to focus its power." Understanding dawned in Thomas's mind. He looked down at his own hammer, the one Edmund had made him, its handle worn smooth by years of honest work. Without hesitation, he reached toward the floating shard. The instant his fingers brushed the light, fire raced up his arm. Not the burning agony he expected, but a warmth like returning home after a long winter. The shard flowed into the hammer's head, its glow suffusing the metal until the entire tool shone like captured sunlight. Gareth's remaining eye widened. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. The old wolf chose well. Outside, Malachi's chanting reached a fever pitch. The green light advanced in a creeping wave, dissolving stone where it passed. Several Forgeborn screamed as it touched them, their armor crumbling to rust in seconds. Thomas barely registered Eleanor shoving him toward the cavern mouth. "Go," she snarled, "while you still can." He wanted to argue, to stand and fight alongside these strange warriors who'd known his master. But the hammer in his hand pulsed urgently, its light forming a protective cocoon around him. The message was clear. His task lay elsewhere. With one last look at Gareth's ruined but unbowed stance, at Eleanor's defiant snarl as she hefted her weapon, Thomas turned and ran deeper into the cavern system. The passages narrowed around him, the hammer's glow his only guide through the twisting darkness. Behind him, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by a single, sonorous voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run, little smith. But know this, no forge burns forever." The words slithered into Thomas's ears like smoke, carrying with them a promise and a threat. He clutched the hammer tighter, its light flaring in response. Somewhere ahead lay answers, about Edmund, about the shard, about his own unexpected role in this ancient war. And though his body ached and his heart grieved for those left behind, Thomas couldn't suppress the wild hope singing in his veins. For the first time in his life, he understood what it truly meant to be a smith.